He's the president of Russia, hard to predict and feared by many. He's not what you'd expect from a head of state, but exactly what you think of a KGB spy.
Born in St. Petersburg in the early 1950s, young Vladimir Putin and his family had a living situation that was entirely common for Soviet citizens of the time. The Putins shared a single apartment with two other families. This meant communal use of the stove, the sink, the restroom, and so forth among all three of the families. Yet the Putin family was actually well set up in the context of the place and time, having the largest room to themselves. It was a 12-foot by 15-foot room the young Vladimir shared with his mother and father. The Putins were also notable in that they had a television set and telephone in their apartment, as well as a small dacha, or vacation home outside of the city to which they could retreat when time permitted. For the times, it was an entirely comfortable upbringing, one that would even have been the envy of many nearly destitute Soviet citizens of the day. Despite the aura of invincibility the adult Putin likes to create around himself, his life has hardly been one long success story. As a young man, Putin was a poor student. He was often tardy and occasionally truant, and did not devote much time or effort to his studies. Furthermore, Putin was often in trouble for things like talking in class, passing notes, and even hurling chalkboard erasers at other students when possessed by fits of anger. His grades were modest at best, and overall he showed little promise during his grade school years. Mediocre performance in grade school and middle school notwithstanding, Putin earned a spot in the respected high school Leningrad School number 281. In his high school years, Putin turned things around. The future Russian president began studying hard and earned much better marks as a result. And at that point, Putin continued to focus on the one area in which he had always shined, athletics, and in particular martial arts. Putin had begun to practice sambo and judo at around age 11, and he showed an immediate aptitude for martial arts, which remain an important part of his life even today. Vladimir Putin has more money than he could easily spend in a lifetime. According to Forbes, Putin is almost assuredly a billionaire, and potentially many times over. However, no one can get a handle on exactly how much money the Russian president is worth, nor can we be exactly sure how he amassed his shadowy wealth either. But there are a handful of prevailing theories that might explain how Putin has become so prosperous. The first major infusion of cash the ostensibly public servant may have gained could have come from his misappropriating the wealth seized from oligarch Mikhail Khodorkovsky, whom Putin and his government had jailed on trumped-up charges in 2003. Much of the cash that was taken from the billionaire was never accounted for, after all. Another theory behind Putin's wealth is even more directly illicit. He might simply be paid by people whom he allows to break the law, or at least skirt it. Putin may well have made millions or even tens of millions through bribes, kickbacks, and thank you payments for helping his cronies to better themselves as long as they better his bank account.
Surely, time has come to change this.
There is one other theory, and it's that Putin is rich in bravado and swagger, but not in cash. He might not have billions or even many millions himself, despite his projection of wealth. But it really would not matter, as he has the state coffers of Russia at his disposal to fund almost any whim. Vladimir Putin was married for a very long time, but has now been divorced for many years. Putin married his now ex-wife on July 8, 1983, after the couple had courted for a couple of years. Born in early 1958, Lyudmila Shkrebnevya was a little more than half a decade Putin's junior and was in her early 20s when they met. She was a stewardess, which was a coveted and competitive job in the USSR in that era. Putin would later say of his marriage to Lyudmila, "I understood that if I didn't marry for another 2 or 3 years, I would never marry. Though, of course, I had made a habit of leading a bachelor's life. Lyudmila uprooted it." So perhaps unsurprisingly, Putin was not exactly a hopeless romantic. It's surprising that the Putins managed to stay married for so many years, all things considered. The couple remained married for 30 years, only divorcing in the year 2013. By the end of the union, there was apparently no love left and plenty of acrimony, with Lyudmila calling her husband a, quote, vampire, with Putin saying at one point that those who could stand to be around his soon-to-be ex-wife for more than 3 weeks deserved to have a monument erected in their honor. Vladimir Putin definitely has at least 2 children, and there's a chance he has more. The Russian president is a master at keeping his personal life secret, despite how often the eyes of the world are on him, so it's quite hard to know for sure. But the 2 known children were born long before he had ascended to top national office, and we do know a few things about them. Both children are daughters, and both were born with Putin's ex-wife Lyudmila, meaning that they would have been born when Putin was still posted in Dresden in East Germany. Vladimir Putin's older daughter, Maria Vorontsova, is a genetics researcher and endocrinologist who lived for some years in the Netherlands, until officials in that country called for her to be expelled, following the suspected Russian-backed downing of a passenger plane in the year 2014. His younger daughter, Katerina Tikhanova, is a scientist who studies physics and mathematics, and is a member of the Russian Council for the Development of Physical Culture and Mass Sports. She is also a former competitive acrobatic dancer. While Vladimir Putin's marriage may have flamed out with no love left at the end of 30 long years, he still has lots of love to give, it seems. and some of that love overlapped, too. Putin has purportedly been involved with former gymnast Alina Kabayeva since the early 2000s, though as per standard operating procedure with the Russian president's personal life, the details here are all quite murky. We know for sure that Putin and Kabayeva have been an item in the past and likely still are, and we know that Kabayeva is a good 3 decades younger than Putin. The former gymnast may be the mother to more Putin children, and she may also be but one of several girlfriends the autocratic ruler has now or has had over the years of the past decade or two. Some sources have hinted that Kabayeva gave birth to twins by Putin, in fact. What is known for sure about Alina Kabayeva herself is that she was an inarguably talented and accomplished gymnast in her heyday, having earned 2 Olympic medals, a gold and a bronze. After leaving sports, Kabayeva tried out modeling, singing, and a few other false start careers. She then entered politics and held a seat in the Duma section of Russia's parliament for nearly a decade. Putin is definitely known for bragging about many things, but when it comes to martial arts, he puts his money where his mouth is. Putin is a black belt in judo, or at least he was, until the International Federation of Judo stripped him of his title in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Lack of title aside, the Russian president has long been recognized as a competent practitioner of judo and sambo, and he has trained in the martial arts since he was a boy. The practice has always been close to Putin's heart, so much so that well into his national political career, he even found time to serve as the head of the same studio where he had trained as a child. It's worth noting that when a noted U.S. Marine judo expert analyzed Putin's performance in judo exhibitions, he confirmed the leader as genuinely capable. Vladimir Putin is fluent in 3 languages. Of course, the native Russian speaks his mother tongue, and he's also quite fluent in German, a language he was compelled to use often during his years in the KGB when he was posted in East Germany. Putin is also known to be able to speak English, but what's not clear is the Russian president's level of fluency in this language. He is reportedly a good enough English speaker to be able to understand the language well enough to not need translators, but he hardly ever reveals this in public. According to Express, it is almost assuredly a careful political calculation that has led to Putin's reticence to speak English in public. After all, geopolitically, most of the nations in which English is the primary language are at odds with Russia, and were even outright enemies of the Soviet Union he served during the early years of his career. In other words, it's a power play, as Express puts it. He is admitted to knowing the language, though, and does use it privately, such as when he spoke directly to director Oliver Stone on several occasions while the American filmmaker interviewed him in 2017.
Do you like it?
Very much.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
Putin does, for the record, often speak in German in public. In what has only become a more and more laughably bitter irony with the unprovoked and illegal invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin was once nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. Yes, the same prize that has been issued to the likes of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., Mother Teresa, and the Dalai Lama, just to name a few. How did Putin find himself even adjacent to the many recipients of this august prize? It was made by the Russian International Academy of Spiritual Unity and Cooperation of Peoples of the World, an advocacy group that reportedly pursues peace around the world. Putin was nominated by the organization thanks to his help in finding a non-military way to punish the Syrian government for using illegal chemical weapons in the course of the protracted Syrian civil war. This is, of course, the same Vladimir Putin who worked closely with the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad on matters such as securing a 50-year lease for Russian extraction of phosphate in regions of Syria. You can say a lot of negative things about Vladimir Putin and have them be true, and you can say a lot of positive things about him and have them be false. But one truth about this complex man is that he loves animals. Now, that's not to say he does not kill animals at times, whether he is hunting big game with a high-powered rifle or fishing while conspicuously shirtless. But nonetheless, he has a soft spot for furry friends. For instance, there was the time that Putin leapt to his feet and snatched a dog held hanging from its scruff by Turkmenistan's president. Putin then cradled and calmed the puppy, protecting it with a notable tenderness. Additionally, there have been many times that Putin has been photographed cuddling with big cats, such as leopards and tigers met at animal sanctuaries. According to the India Times, Putin may own as many as 700 cars. While the most visible car associated with Putin is his official state car, an RS Senate limousine, it is hardly his only vehicle. Putin owns a broad array of cars of all types, and he apparently also may have as many as 58 aircraft. Putin also, of course, has a mega yacht that is worth around $100 million. For a bit of perspective here, according to TASS, the median monthly salary in Russia was 32,422 rubles, or about $450 per month in 2020. That amounts to a median annual income of about $5,400 in US dollars, which is not enough to buy a plane or yacht or even a limousine. While at university, Putin met Anatoly Sobchak, one of his law professors who would become important in his future political career. During his final year at Leningrad State University, Putin was finally contacted by the KGB. After being put on a probationary track, he officially joined the agency after graduating in 1975. A Wilson Quarterly article, The Once and Future Russia, explains that initially Putin was relegated to a local Leningrad branch rather than being given, quote, a more desirable foreign post. Former KGB agent Oleg Kalunjin claimed that all that office did was harass dissidents and ordinary citizens, as well as hunt futilely for spies. And despite the millions of rubles and thousands of man-hours spent, between 1960 and 1980, not a single spy was caught by the local Leningrad KGB. Putin was a, quote, low-level cog. Radio Free Europe reports that Putin's work with the Leningrad branch mainly consisted of recruiting foreigners who came to the Soviet Union and Soviet citizens who communicated with foreigners or were going abroad. The KGB, which stands for Komitet Gosударственной Безопасности, was the Soviet Union's intelligence agency, security agency, and secret police rolled into one. Although the modern KGB was established in 1954, it had its roots in the Cheka, established by Vladimir Lenin in 1917. According to PBS, the KGB had their hands in everything from running the Gulag labor camps to engaging in espionage. The agency conducted assassinations as well, with nearly untraceable poison often a go-to weapon, according to Big Think. The Atlantic reports that Vladimir Putin was recruited to the KGB by Yuri Andropov, then chairman of the KGB, as part of the agency's attempt to bring in people from different societal groups. During the 1970s, Andropov developed a recruitment scheme to bring some new perspectives into the KGB and create an atmosphere for finding new ideas and dealing with the state's myriad problems. In 1985, Putin received a foreign posting, working in Dresden, East Germany under the cover of a translator. Although information on his time there is scant, his duties were apparently similar to those in Leningrad. The Washington Post reports that Putin likely sought out East Germans who had a plausible reason to travel abroad, such as professors, journalists, scientists, and technicians, who could covertly link up with agents permanently stationed in the West. But according to Politico, it's possible that Putin had a far more significant role. A former member of the Red Army faction, a far-left German terrorist group active from 1970 to 1998, claimed that Putin supported their operations. Since the organization had difficulty buying weapons in West Germany, they'd reportedly pass a list of weapons off to Putin and his colleagues, who would make sure that an agent in the West would set up a drop-off in a secret location. However, since most of the Red Army faction members are either in jail or dead, this claim is difficult to verify. In 2015, however, an investigation by Corrective revealed that Putin likely had more authority in Dresden than initially suggested, possibly responsible for a plan that involved blackmailing a professor with, quote, pornographic material. There's even a suggestion that he took part in an operation tasked with stealing technological secrets. Though little is known about Putin's Dresden assignments, he was rising through the ranks of the KGB during his time in East Germany. The Moscow Times reveals that by 1990, he had become a lieutenant colonel, and the year before had been given a bronze medal for, quote, outstanding service to the East German National People's Army. The KGB was closely intertwined with the State Security Service, or Stasi, of the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany. The Stasi participated in their own intelligence and secret police activities, but the tie between the two services was so close that Stasi officers were considered, quote, Chekists of the Soviet Union, according to author John O. Kohler. East Germany was also significant for the KGB because it lay on the front lines of the Cold War. It was a place where agents could cross from one side to the other, and it held more than 300,000 Soviet troops and an assortment of Soviet intermediate-range missiles. According to a Stasi defector, the GDR could do nothing without coordination with the Soviets. The Stasi's surveillance operations were instrumental for the KGB. Monitoring hundreds of thousands of German citizens, the Stasi's amassed millions of documents, and the KGB kept tabs on those who could take justifiable trips abroad. In the secret Stasi files, over 10,000 people were marked as being, quote, of interest to the KGB. According to the New York Times, in 2018, Putin's Stasi photo ID card was even discovered in German archives. And although this doesn't imply that Putin worked directly for the Stasi, it proves that Putin had access to the Stasi's headquarters in Dresden, most likely for recruiting locals for his intelligence work. As the Berlin Wall came crumbling down, the tide started to turn. It took a month, but eventually the protests reached Dresden. Time magazine reveals that in 1989, German protesters gathered outside Vladimir Putin's office and threatened to storm the building, calling for an end to the Soviet-backed government. In his official biography, Putin claimed that he frantically requested instructions from Moscow but received no reply. The BBC reports that Putin and his KGB colleagues decided in lieu of official instructions, they should simply burn all evidence of their work. Putin himself recalls, "I personally burned a huge amount of material. We burned so much that the furnace burst." According to Russia Beyond, the most prized documents went to Moscow, but everything else went up in flames. Although Putin realized that the GDR's collapse was, quote, inevitable, according to The Atlantic, what he regretted was the fact that the Soviet Union had lost its position in Europe. Although intellectually I understood that a position based on walls and water barriers cannot exist forever, but I wanted something different to rise in its place, and nothing different was proposed. That's what hurt. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, coming shortly after the end of communist rule in East Germany, was for Putin and like-minded colleagues a crisis of epic proportions.
When I say that the fall of the USSR was one of the greatest catastrophes of the 20th century, I'm talking about a humanitarian catastrophe above all.
By 1991, Putin had returned with his family to St. Petersburg and retired from the KGB. But in 2004, he claimed that there is no such thing as a former KGB man. On returning to the Soviet Union, Putin initially planned on doing a doctoral dissertation and working at Leningrad State University. But after his former professor Anatoly Sobchak was elected mayor of Moscow in 1991, Putin joined his team as an advisor and, quote, head of external relations. But according to the two worlds of Vladimir Putin, Putin also continued his work as a spy. DW reports that Putin started working for the St. Petersburg City Hall 1 year before Sobchak's election, and from his earliest days there, his work came under scrutiny when it was discovered that Putin had permitted the sale of highly undervalued steel in exchange for foreign food aid that never arrived. An investigation recommended that Putin be fired, but his termination never came. From March 1994 to 1996, Putin served as Sobchak's deputy mayor. Putin was incredibly loyal to Sobchak, and when Sobchak narrowly lost the election in 1996, Putin left St. Petersburg. ABC reports that Sobchak continued to be Putin's mentor, though, gearing him towards national politics. Putin soon set out from Moscow and the presidential administration. In 1997, Putin was named Deputy Chief of Staff to Boris Yeltsin, then President of Russia. The following year, Putin was named Chief of the FSB, a successor organization of the KGB. According to Radio Free Europe, in 1993, Yeltsin had tried to dilute the former KGB's power by taking the Vympel Special Forces Unit out of the FSB. But 2 months after Putin became the new director in 1998, he brought the Vympel unit back under FSB control. Before long, Yeltsin promoted Putin again, this time to the position of prime minister on August 9, 1999. At the time, Putin was Yeltsin's fifth prime minister in under 2 years. CNN reports that Yeltsin claimed that Putin was the ideal choice to handle the Caucasus crisis. Putin would eventually stabilize that crisis. Many ended up criticizing his brutal response to the conflicts in Dagestan and Chechnya. It was clear, though, from the beginning that Yeltsin wanted Putin as his successor, and on December 31, 1999, as Yeltsin resigned, he named Putin acting president.
The secret agent who became president.
Vladimir Putin.
Vladimir Putin wanted to create a system grounded in nationalistic fervor and subservience to ruling institutions. During his first stint as Russian prime minister, he fleshed out that vision in a 1999 document titled Russia at the Turn of the Millennium. Commonly referred to as the Millennium Manifesto, the document presented Putin's reading of Russia's past and future prospects. In the document, the then prime minister primarily attributed Russia's history of political upheaval to a divided populace. Denizens had grown overly enamored with foreign concepts like free speech and individuality. For Russia to take its place in the pantheon of great nations, citizens needed to unite under a muscular central government. Rather fittingly, 2 days after unveiling his manifesto on Russian destiny, Putin became president. 10 years separated the fall of the Berlin Wall and Vladimir Putin's ascent to the Russian presidency. During much of that intervening period, Putin was a relative unknown, and once he became known, he aroused little confidence among political experts. Even when Boris Yeltsin promoted Putin to prime minister in 1999, analysts largely agreed that the upstart would have limitations as far as what he could accomplish. Putin's track record up to that point was fairly barren. After serving briefly as deputy mayor of Leningrad, Putin worked under President Boris Yeltsin between 1998 and 1999. He started as a liaison between the Kremlin and lower government offices, became head of security for a while, and soon got tapped to be prime minister. 5 months later, Yeltsin stepped down and named Putin president. In less than 2 years, Putin had gone from being a political question mark to a giant red exclamation point. However, as the Washington Post reported, The young president won public approval by waging an aggressive war against Chechen rebels and touting himself as a tough guy. When the time came to officially elect a new Russian president, Putin won decisively.
Future starts here and now. Future is you.
In many ways, Vladimir Putin is a historical hybrid, a Soviet-era holdover adapted to modern times. That becomes abundantly clear when one examines the way he wields information as both a shield and a weapon. As Wired explained, unfettered information makes Putin uncomfortable, given his KGB training. For years, knowledge was what you stole or withheld from others, not something you nakedly shared with the world. Moreover, the collapse of the Soviet Union coincided with increased internet access and intellectual independence. In Putin's mind, it was a sign that society had veered off course and needed correcting. As president, he resolved to return Russia to a kind of pre-knowledge state. Initially, Putin limited his focus to controlling television and newspapers, unaware of the internet's true transformative potential. Then, 2011 happened. That year, oppressed Arab citizens lashed out against their government in response to damning documents released by WikiLeaks. Social media sites like Facebook and Twitter helped fuel the uprisings. Tunisia's government toppled.
Either this is the first Arab revolution of the 21st century, or it will be brutally suppressed.
In Russia, accusations of electoral chicanery spurred voter unrest. But unlike Moscow in 1989, Putin refused to stay silent. It was time to drop the hammer, and also the sickle if need be. In 2012, the Kremlin began quashing unwanted websites and sent internet trolls after bloggers and journalists who criticized the regime. Naturally, hacking became a technological trump card. Despite ruling Russia for the better part of 20 years, Vladimir Putin has remained unreadable as ever to presidents and pundits alike. It's almost as if a former Soviet spy with a law degree and a strong dislike of political transparency has been running the show all this time. And what a show it's been. New York Times contributor and longtime Russia correspondent Stephen Myers spent years observing the workings of the Kremlin and offered a few insights on what makes Putin so impenetrable. Unsurprisingly, Putin keeps the media on a tight leash and himself on an even tighter one. During interviews, he answers controversial questions with cautiously worded equivocations, always sure not to paint himself into a corner. Aside from heavily scripted press conferences and choreographed public engagements, most of what he does goes unreported. Meanwhile, the slightest hint of criticism from any public figure gets swiftly snuffed out. Putin also puts up a technological wall, though not necessarily in the way that you think. In a 2014 Time article, Simon Schuster argued that the ex-spy's aversion to using modern technology has made him incredibly difficult to tap. He doesn't use a cell phone. He owns a computer but avoids using the internet. Additionally, Putin gets his news delivered directly by intelligence officials via folders and paper documents. It goes without saying that the president of Russia is extremely tech-averse. Vladimir Putin's life has spanned an absurd number of historic events. He was born 5 months before Joseph Stalin's death. He witnessed communism's collapse firsthand and inherited his first presidency from the Soviet Union's last leader. Furthermore, Putin literally reshaped another country by taking one of its territories. Given his seemingly forever long reign, many have wondered when will Putin retire from politics. In 2014, Russian reporters asked the president point-blank whether he intended to change the constitution to make his reign permanent. Putin responded that changing the constitution would be, quote, detrimental for the country. He also added that he had no intentions of doing it. The Independent noted that Russia's constitution prohibits presidents from having more than 2 consecutive terms. Putin became a 3-term president by simply taking a break in between to become prime minister a second time. However, in 2021, he signed a law that would allow him to potentially serve until 2036. The new legislation essentially zeroes out his previous terms. Currently, nobody knows his intentions because, as Putin put it, he has yet to decide if he'll leave the presidency. After all, the truly powerful don't have to cling to their power. They simply have it.
Did you know that the Russian president's bodyguards date back to the Tsars? And that President Putin still uses a food taster like a king? Russian President Vladimir Putin is reportedly extremely cautious when it comes to his security and health. According to the New York Post, Putin has taken extreme measures to keep from getting sick, maintaining large distances between himself and anyone he meets with, including foreign dignitaries and even his own advisors. Putin also donned a hazmat suit and a full-face respirator while visiting a hospital in 2020. Putin is also concerned about the threat of assassination attempts and coups. He surrounds himself with bodyguards who are quick to act if they fear their president is in danger. UFC fighter Conor McGregor found out firsthand in 2018 when he put his hand on Putin's shoulder. According to the Post, Putin's bodyguards are part of the Federal Protective Service. The special unit calls itself the Musketeers, and they've been around a long time. The unit can be traced back to the 19th century when they were tasked with protecting Tsar Alexander III after the assassination of his father, Alexander II. That assassination was carried out by a terrorist organization that called itself the People's Will, whose goal was to overthrow the government. Alexander II was killed by a bomb on the streets of St. Petersburg after several failed assassination attempts in which the People's Will tried to shoot him, derail his train, and blow up his palace. So who makes up the Musketeers of today? They're mostly combat veterans, right? Actually, that's not Putin's top priority. A former president's security employee told Russia Beyond, an arm of the Russia state media, it's unlikely that the president's security guard will have to arrange ambushes on mountain trails or jump with a parachute. Combat experience is useful, but it's often not applicable in our work. During war, you attack, and a bodyguard should only protect the dignitary from someone invisible. Russia Beyond says former police officers don't quite fit the bill either, since a bodyguard's work doesn't necessarily involve apprehending would-be attackers. Their job is to protect the president. Putin told director Oliver Stone they've done just that.
In other words, you trust your security, and they've done a great job.
Potential bodyguards are required to be good at anticipating possible threats, have some familiarity with politics, and have linguistic skills. They have to be under 35 years old. They also must be between about 5 feet 9 inches and 6 feet 3 inches tall, and need to weigh between 165 and 200 pounds. According to the Post, it is believed that upon reaching age 35, guards are replaced and often handed jobs elsewhere in the Russian government. Putin's security detail scouts locations ahead of time. They run through worst-case scenarios that could play out, sometimes even planning for hypothetical situations involving natural disasters. Putin's security detail inspects anywhere he will be staying, including active surveillance on electronic devices. They install jamming devices to prevent bombs from being remotely detonated. According to Russia Beyond, Putin's guards carry 9mm Gurza pistols, which can fire 40 armor-piercing rounds per minute. Putin's bodyguards are often seen carrying briefcases, which are actually bulletproof shields. They've also been seen carrying umbrellas made of Kevlar. The Post reports that when Putin makes public appearances, he is surrounded by multiple bands of bodyguards. There are typically 4 rings of guards around Putin at any time, including the guards closest to Putin, who typically wear dark suits, sunglasses, and earpieces. These guards are often seen in a ready position, according to Russia Beyond, in which one of their hands is raised, prepared to jump into action. Other members of his security detail are not quite as conspicuous. Guards stationed further from the Russian president try to blend in with crowds. There are usually snipers in the area as well. Putin usually travels in a heavily armed motorcade consisting of armored vehicles, machine guns, and anti-aircraft missiles. In 2012, Gilles Brigard, who founded Club des Chefs, an organization that cooks for heads of state, told The Telegraph that food tasters have been used to protect the president too. Tasters still exist, but only in the Kremlin, where a doctor checks every dish with the chef. It has also been alleged that Putin has employed the use of body doubles over the years. According to the Post, Putin admitted in a 2020 interview that he had been offered body doubles for trips to Chechnya in the early 2000s, but he had declined the offer.
One of the most common tactics deployed by President Vladimir Putin is simply to show up late.
Hello, Vlad, it's Barack. I've been trying to call you all day. Where you been?
Sorry, I've been playing iPhone game Candy Crush.
While this may make people like your punctual dad grind their teeth in frustration, it's pretty clearly a power tactic that's been employed by Putin again and again in order to make his counterparts sweat. According to Business Insider, Putin kept President Donald Trump waiting for almost an hour before a 2018 summit in Helsinki, Finland. That wasn't so bad compared to the hours that he makes officials from Ukraine wait, or the one time he made the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, wait for a whopping 4 hours. Even Pope Francis had to wait an hour to meet with Putin. It was likely cold comfort to Trump, who may have known that others were taken more seriously by Putin. Queen Elizabeth II of England, for instance, only had to wait 14 minutes for Putin to roll into their meeting, per Business Insider. President Joe Biden's June 2021 summit with Putin was a little different, however. Stanford professor and foreign policy expert Michael McFaul tweeted that he had seen the summit schedule ahead of time, noting a key detail: Putin would arrive first. McFaul wrote, if Putin is late tomorrow, Biden won't be standing around awkwardly waiting. It's not exactly a big political win, but when it comes to establishing a relationship with the famously stance-conscious Putin, it's still a significant move. Meetings with other leaders may lead directly to signed agreements and policy changes, but that's not always the case. And when it comes to summits and face-to-face encounters with Putin, few analysts expect direct results every single time. Rather, leaders who meet with him should expect to play a long game. And what is that long game, exactly? It's not just about posturing, though it arguably is when it comes to President Vladimir Putin and many other leaders, but it's also about communication. Ambassador John J. Sullivan, who was appointed ambassador to the Russian Federation by President Trump in 2019, certainly says as such. Sullivan told CNN, "We don't think of U.S.-Russia summits in terms of deliverables. We are thinking of it as an opportunity to communicate what our intentions and capabilities are." It seems that President Vladimir Putin and his team aren't above using intimidation tactics that draw on an individual's everyday fears. Never mind that someone is an important political leader who's there to discuss important issues and possibly even get something done about the matter. How can they be intimidated and overpowered at the meeting? And what are their opinions on dogs? Strange as this may seem, dogs became a bit of an issue during a 2007 meeting between Chancellor Angela Merkel and Putin. According to The New Yorker, the incident in question happened when the two were discussing energy issues in Putin's home in Sochi, Russia. His black lab entered the room and sniffed Merkel. Putin surely knew that Merkel, who had been bitten by a dog in 1995, was afraid of the animal. Yet he reportedly sat back and casually said, quote, "I'm sure it will behave itself," as Merkel continued the meeting in a rather tense mood. Later, as the German press came to Merkel's defense, she told reporters, "I understand why he has to do this, to prove he's a man. Russia has nothing, no successful politics or economy. All they have is this." Yet, in that moment of power play, Putin may well have assumed that he won on this small front, regardless of Germany's later complaints, and all because of his large and intimidating pet dog. One might get the sense that President Vladimir Putin is something of a bully on a geopolitical scale, at least if you're on the receiving end of one of his grievances. Those barbs, according to John Feiner, who was the chief of staff to U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry from 2015 to 2017, could often take the form of a list of complaints. As Feiner told NPR, the Russians have a way of trying to start these meetings with a long litany of grievances, going back sometimes decades. That may be annoying to some diplomats, to be sure, but it can also be a crippling distraction technique. After all, if a representative is there to talk about Russia's incursion into Ukraine or its role in a civil war, then what good is it to talk about the Cold War? Trying to fight back against these accusations, whether or not Putin has a point, is only going to waste time and put the non-Russian negotiators on an uncomfortable defensive. Instead, Feiner argued, it's better to let Putin and his team air their grievances, make a show of taking in their comments, and then pivot to the matters at hand. Feiner told NPR, the Russians have a coherent worldview. And so to go in thinking that they are irrational in these views, I think, is not a constructive way forward. In his June 2021 summit with President Vladimir Putin, President Joe Biden put the meeting deliberately later in his touring schedule, well after other meetups with European leaders. He reportedly did so to have the wind at his back, according to CNN, and to show increased political support for U.S. interests throughout the region. That can be a pretty significant step, even though it may seem like a small thing to outside observers. Putin is no fool, after all, and he would surely notice if other leaders in Europe or elsewhere were rallying around Biden or another summit meeting counterpart. Now, this is not exactly a bombastic tactic, nor is it an intimidating one, but it can often be used to send a significant message. Joe Biden said that he believes President Vladimir Putin responds most to, quote, signs of strength that are best communicated in person, per a report from CNN. It seems a telephone call simply won't cut it in the political one-on-one between two leaders, especially where the Russian president is concerned. Biden even reportedly told Putin to his face during a 2011 meeting.
I said, Mr. President, I'm looking into your eyes, and you have no soul.
While some presidents or premiers might take exception to that, it seems that Putin was unruffled by the blunt remark, perhaps because of the way in which it was delivered in person. According to Biden, Putin appeared to be satisfied by the remark and even told Biden at that meeting that, quote, we understand each other. Yet, when Biden later told a reporter he believed Putin was a, quote, killer, the statement caused serious upset in Russia, leading to the recall of the U.S. ambassador there. It could be that the lack of a direct meeting contributed to the controversy.
Not much happens in Russia without Vladimir Putin.
While CNN reports that few, if any, leaders expect so-called deliverables from a single meeting, neither should they think that things end when they walk out of the room. Axios notes that dealing with Putin can prove pretty challenging for anyone, especially when it comes to resolving conflicts and speaking about the meeting itself. Furthermore, it's not as if some of the big issues that other leaders have pinpointed with Russia's activities have ended after a single meeting. After all, as Michael McFaul told NPR, Putin has never admitted to a mistake ever in 20 years of running that country. And so, Russian incursions into foreign territory, like their invasion of nearby Georgia and parts of Ukraine, persist. Coming to some understanding and action on these sorts of issues with the iron-willed and seemingly immovable Putin will almost certainly never happen over the course of a single summit or presidential administration.
It all started on February 24, 2000. While attending the funeral of Anatoly Sobchak in St. Petersburg. It's believed that this was the first known attempt to assassinate the Russian president, but the Federal Guard Service was there to protect him. The press secretary for the Federal Guard Service commented on the matter, saying that it was not a psychopath, but a certain organization was behind the attempt. The same year, there was another attempted assassination that was prevented by security forces. A group of former Russian leaders met with world leaders at the Yalta Summit of the Commonwealth of Independent States. During the summit, which took place on August 18th and 19th, 2000, a person was halted from killing Putin, who had been targeted specifically among the international leaders. He was among presidents from Azerbaijan, Georgia, Tajikistan, and several other countries who also attended, but the would-be assassin was only focused on taking out Putin. The security service chief at the time announced they had successfully stopped the assassination attempt after the summit had concluded. Although the documents about this remain classified, several people, including 4 Chechens and an unspecified number of Middle Eastern nationals, were arrested in connection with the assassination attempt. In 2002, Putin was once again in danger. 3 months before Putin was set to visit Baku Azeri, security members were given information on an attempt set for January 2002. An Iraqi citizen with links to Afghanistan and Chechen rebel forces planned to deliver explosives to a co-conspirator. The man was arrested along with his accomplice. They were sentenced to 10 years in prison. 1 month later, there was another threat. This time, it was up close and personal. A man drove into the Kremlin complex and jumped out of his car to talk to security members. He claimed to be the president of Russia and demanded to be taken to Putin. The surprise security team checked his documents and then sent him to receive an evaluation at a nearby hospital. Doctors reported back that the mentally ill assassin had attempted the same thing in 2001, and both times had enthusiastically told people that he wanted to kill Putin. He told his psychiatrist that Putin was bringing Nazism to Russia and that he was an undercover spy. In his diary, he wrote that he needed to cut off Putin's head. He was convinced that he was avenging his brother, who had died by beheading some years before. The next attempt came in November 2002 when Putin was supposed to be driving along a highway near the Kremlin. There were a group of people who claimed they were installing new signboards along the way. Just hours later, a media outlet reported that they had found 40 kilos of explosives set to detonate along the road. But the devices then disappeared. Vladimir Putin's car was rerouted. To this day, officials refuse to comment on the matter and deny that it ever took place. Something very similar happened the next year. In June of 2003, a highway near St. Petersburg was targeted while President Putin's car was supposed to be on it. This time, police found a poorly made bomb hidden in a bag. Once again, no one was harmed, and Russian officials denied that the situation ever happened. In 2008, a sniper took aim at Putin, who was leaving the office of the president with Dmitry Medvedev, who was the incoming president. The two were reportedly taking a walk after Medvedev won the 2008 presidential election. They were strolling in the area surrounding the Kremlin, which is known to be heavily guarded and have top-notch security, which is fortunate for the two leaders. The sniper was spotted and the assassination attempt was a failure. The next attempt to kill Vladimir Putin was in 2012. A group of Chechens intended to detonate a roadside bomb, but again, the plan was foiled before Putin was harmed. Although it's difficult to determine the exact number, Putin has escaped at least 7 assassination attempts. This is partially due to the tight security for Russian officials. Security is very strong in the Kremlin complex, where many official government meetings take place. Alexei Navalny was not only one of the most vocal of Vladimir Putin's critics, but he was largely viewed as the biggest internal threat to his regime. He was at the head of his own political entity, and his organized protests, human rights work, and exposés into Russia's elite galvanized the public. Navalny was targeted by several attacks that made it clear that his life was at risk and led to him recovering outside of Russia. When he returned in 2021, he was immediately arrested. The 47-year-old Navalny was looking at the next 3 decades in jail when it was announced that he had died after returning from a walk and collapsing. In spite of the February 2024 reports, Navalny's family has said they're not sure what to believe. His wife Yulia also issued a statement that said, "Putin and his government lie incessantly, but if this is true, I want Putin, his entire entourage, Putin's friends, his government to know that they will bear responsibility for what they did to our country, to my family, to my husband." Others have also made it clear that they had no questions about responsibility. Navalny's chief of staff, Leonid Volkov, said, "If this is true, then it's not Navalny died, but Putin killed Navalny."
Make no mistake. Putin is responsible for Navalny's death.
In June of 2023, the Wagner paramilitary group staged an uprising against Putin. The action was almost over as quickly as it got started, and although there was a lot of news officially unverified, it was confirmed that the head of the uprising was Yevgeny Prigozhin. While many expected Putin's camp to retaliate quickly and with finality, something surprising happened. Nothing much at all. Prigozhin's mutiny was reportedly being looked at as an ill-informed choice made in error. Unlikely? Perhaps, but it wasn't the end of the story. In August of the same year, Prigozhin was killed in a plane crash along with 9 others. The plane went down about half an hour outside of Moscow, and the official word from within Russia was that he had been killed by traitors to Russia. Russia's official media didn't report on his death at all, and other media outlets, including the Associated Press, pointed to the Kremlin's silence over his death and the investigation into the cause of the plane crash as looking incredibly suspicious. Yevgeny Kamaganov was a Buryat journalist who was known for his articles criticizing the federal government. Writing for Informpolis around 2004 to 2005, Kamaganov was previously detained by the Organized Crime Division and questioned about his trip to Irkutsk in the Ust-Ordinsky district. Kamaganov worked out of the Ulan-Ude, the capital of Buryatia. He briefly returned to his home village after attackers broke his neck in July 2015. But on February 27, 2017, Karagamov returned to Ulan-Ude. At the time of his death, Kamaganov was the editor-in-chief of the site of the Buryat People, an Asia-Russia daily. Although it's unclear exactly what happened, Kamaganov was hospitalized on March 10th. Some reports claim it was after being beaten by unknown attackers, while other reports claim that it was because of complications from diabetes. On March 16th, Kamaganov passed away in the hospital. A precise cause of death has never been determined. Sergei Yushchenkov was one of the leaders of the Liberal Russia Party. He was described as an outspoken advocate of human rights who was openly critical of Putin's administration, the FSB, and their actions in the Chechen Republic. But on April 17, 2003, just hours after registering the Liberal Russian Party for the parliamentary elections, Yushchenkov was shot and murdered outside of his home in Moscow. Mikhail Kodenev was convicted of contracting the assassination of Yushchenkov for $60,000 in order to take control of the Liberal Russian Party's funding. However, Boris Berezovsky, who was an associate of Kodenev, maintained that Russian authorities were responsible for the assassination.
What we need to do is understand Vladimir Putin for what he is, a murderer and a thug.
Nikolai Andrushenko made a name for himself as a journalist at Novi Petersburg, a newspaper he co-founded in the 1990s. As a journalist, Andrushenko focused on local corruption, criminal activities, and police brutality. He was also an early critic of President Putin and his administration. On March 9, 2017, on the way to a meeting, Andrushenko was reportedly ambushed and beaten by unknown attackers. He wasn't found for several hours until a passerby noticed him lying unconscious in the street with a head wound. Taken to the hospital, Andrushenko underwent brain surgery and was put into a medically induced coma. However, he'd never wake up again and died on April 19th. Although some sources claim that Andrushenko had hit his head during a drunken fall, the journalist had publicly spoken about being attacked twice before March 9th. Yuri Sheachian started working at Novaya Gazeta in 1996, reporting on corruption, organized crime, and the Chechnyan conflict. Sheachian campaigned against the war in Chechnya under Boris Yeltsin, who served as Russia's president from 1991 to 1999 and continued his opposition under Putin's regime as well. After publishing an article for Novaya Gazeta on how the prosecutor general's office had taken a bribe of $2 million to stop an investigation into a smuggling and corruption case involving a Moscow furniture store, Sheachian started receiving death threats. After the corruption case went nowhere, Sheachian wrote a letter to President Putin asking him to look into the case in April 2002. After over a year, still nothing had come out of the corruption case, so Sheachian published another article about it on June 2, 2003. Then, on June 17, Sheachian felt ill with flu-like symptoms. Within a few days, he was hospitalized as his organs started failing one by one. He also lost his hair and his skin started peeling off his body. On July 3, 2003, Sheachian died in the hospital. Doctors diagnosed Shah-Chian with Lyle's syndrome, but his clinical test results were classified as medical secret. Anna Politkovskaya got into journalism early, working as a reporter for Izvestia right after college, and then becoming a journalist for Novaya Gazeta in 1999. At Novaya Gazeta, Politkovskaya became nationally known for her reporting, especially due to her writing about the Second Chechen War. Traveling through Chechnya and Ingushetia, Politkovskaya reported on the human rights abuses that were taking place on both sides of the conflict. She was also critical of Ramzan Kadyrov, who was installed by Vladimir Putin as the Prime Minister of Chechnya. In her last interview with the news website Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty, Politkovskaya gave this description of Kadyrov. Kadyrov is a puppet, coward armed to the teeth and surrounded by security guards. I don't think he will become president of Chechnya. Less than 1 year after Politkovskaya's murder, Putin named Kadyrov as acting president of Chechnya. Politkovskaya was also vocally critical of Putin and wrote several books, such as Putin's Russia, that denounced the corruption and human rights abuses enabled and promoted by Putin and his administration. On October 7, 2006, Politkovskaya was found dead in the elevator of her Moscow apartment building. She had been shot 5 times, with 4 of the shots fired at point-blank range. 6 men were sentenced to prison for the murder, and although her murder was considered a contract killing, it's never been proven who paid for the assassination. Alexander Litvinenko joined the KGB in 1988 and continued his work as the Russian spy organization became the FSB in the 1990s. But in 1998, Litvinenko accused the FSB of illegal activities and exposed a plot to murder Boris Berezovsky, who would later be assassinated in 2013. Litvinenko was briefly arrested for, quote, abusing his office. After being acquitted, he fled to the United Kingdom in 2000, where he was granted asylum. There, Litvinenko wrote 2 books, including Blowing Up Russia, in which he accused FSB agents of illegal and terroristic activities such as perpetrating the 1999 Moscow apartment bombings. Litvinenko was also outspoken in his criticism of Putin and his human rights violations in Chechnya. On November 1, 2006, after meeting Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtin at the Millennium Hotel in London, Litvinenko fell ill. On November 23, Litvinenko died from acute radiation injury, the same day that doctors were finally able to attribute his illness to polonium-210. In September 2021, the European Court of Human Rights found that it was beyond a reasonable doubt that Litvinenko's assassination had been carried out by Lugovoy and Kovtin. A 2016 British inquiry also concluded that the killing was likely directed by the FSB. Although the Russian administration has repeatedly denied involvement in Litvinenko's murder, Russian authorities have also failed to carry out an investigation or prove that the assassination was a rogue operation.
I think it will alter the way that millions and millions of people around the world view Mr. Putin.
Sergei Magnitsky worked as a tax advisor for the investment company Hermitage Capital, which Russian authorities started investigating for tax avoidance in the late 2000s. On June 4, 2007, authorities raided Hermitage Capital's Moscow offices. After the raid, Magnitsky alleged that officials from the Russian Interior Ministry were able to fraudulently take over companies belonging to Hermitage Capital and get $230 million out of the Russian tax system. However, after Magnitsky presented formal complaints to the authorities in 2008, a subsequent investigative team ended up arresting Magnitsky. Magnitsky was held in detention for 11 months, and on July 1, 2009, he was diagnosed with pancreatitis and gallstones. An operation was scheduled, but on the day of the operation, Magnitsky was transferred to Butyurka prison, which lacked the medical equipment and facilities necessary to treat him. This was also the 6th time that Magnitsky was moved to another detention center. On November 16, 2009, Magnitsky was found dead in his cell after his condition had deteriorated without treatment. The European Court of Human Rights determined that Magnitsky was imprisoned out of revenge, and that the state failed to protect the prisoner's life and health. However, there was no mention of whether Magnitsky was murdered in the court's decision. Starting off as a provincial governor in 1991, Boris Nemtsov was the youngest governor in post-Soviet Russia. Nemtsov became Boris Yeltsin's deputy prime minister, and many thought that he would succeed Yeltsin as president. Instead, Putin became president of the Russian Federation in 2000. Although Nemtsov initially tried to work with Putin, he soon joined the opposition along with his party, the Union of Right Forces, after his party was voted out of the parliament in 2003. Nemtsov supported Ukraine's Orange Revolution in 2004 and was vocally critical of Russia's invasion and occupation of Ukraine, as well as its annexation of Crimea in 2014. At the time of his death, Nemtsov was involved in organizing a rally in Moscow against Russia's military involvement in Ukraine. On February 27, 2015, Nemtsov was shot in the back 4 times while crossing a bridge near the Kremlin in Moscow. In one of his last interviews, Nemtsov said that he was afraid Putin was going to have him murdered. Almost immediately, the investigative committee into his death claimed that Islamic extremism was being considered a possible motive. The New Yorker reported that a former political advisor to Putin and critic of the Kremlin said that the president was stunned by the murder. 5 Chechen men were later arrested and found guilty of assassinating Nemtsov after being contracted to do so. However, it's unknown who was responsible for contracting the killing. Anastasia Badarova was a journalism student at Moscow State University. At the time of her murder, she was working as a freelance journalist for Novaya Gazeta. Her work primarily focused on race-motivated crimes and neo-Nazi groups, and Novaya Gazeta was frequently critical of Putin's government. On January 19, 2009, Badarova was covering a news conference at which Stanislav Markielov, a human rights lawyer, disparaged the early release of Yuri Budandov, a Russian army officer who had been convicted of abducting and murdering Elza Kungaeva, a young Chechen woman, in March 2000. After the news conference, as Badarova and Markielov walked and talked, a person wearing a ski mask came up and shot Markielov in the back of the head. Frontline Defenders writes that as Badarova tried to stop the murderer, she was also shot in the head. Badarova died several hours later. According to Alia Kirov's book, Historical Dictionary of the Chechen Conflict, Badarova was the 4th Novaya Gazeta journalist to be murdered since 2000. Nikita Tikhonov and Yevgenia Hasis, described as members of the ultranationalist group Ruski Obraz, were convicted of the murders. Ilya Gayashev was later sentenced to life in prison and determined to be the mastermind of Badarova and Markielov's deaths. Stanislav Markielov was a prominent human rights advocate and lawyer in the Russian Federation. Markielov's work often focused on defending people who were victims of police brutality or attacks from neo-Nazis. Markielov was also known for defending dissident journalists and anti-fascists. Before being assassinated in the same incident as Anastasia Badarova, Markielov announced at the press conference that he planned to appeal the early release of Yuri Budandov with the International Court. Although right-wing extremists were convicted for Markielov's murder, some have questioned whether or not security services were also involved. These suspicions come out of the fact that the weapon used to assassinate Markielov and Badarova was a gun model that was only made available to Russian military and security service personnel. Boris Berezovsky was a former engineer who sold cars after the fall of the Soviet Union. By 1994, he'd survived one assassination attempt that resulted in the death of his driver. In 1994, Berezovsky also acquired ORT, a television channel, and used it to help Boris Yeltsin win the presidential election in 1996. Berezovsky wielded a great deal of power in Yeltsin's administration, and when Putin succeeded Yeltsin as president, Berezovsky had this to say about the new Russian leader.
I think that Putin will continue the way which President Yeltsin established in Russia.
Before long, the two were at odds with one another to such a point where Putin seized ORT from Berezovsky, causing Berezovsky to flee to London. Berezovsky was granted political asylum in the UK in 2003, and in 2007, a Russian court convicted him of fraud and tax evasion in absentia. Meanwhile, Berezovsky accused Putin of poisoning Litvinenko. On March 23, 2013, Berezovsky was found dead with a scarf around his neck at his home in Ascot, England. Reuters reports that coroner Peter Bedford recorded an open verdict at the inquest, saying that it was impossible to be absolutely certain whether or not Berezovsky killed himself or was murdered. Others have suggested that since Berezovsky was often used as a scapegoat for the Russian government, it's possible that the authorities would have been more interested in keeping him alive. Natalia Istimirova started working with Memorial Human Rights Center, a Russian human rights organization in Grozny, Chechnya, in September 1999. The Guardian described her death as both appalling and predictable, especially since she was a close friend and collaborator of both Politkovskaya and Markielov. After Politkovskaya's murder in 2006, Istimirova started actively publishing in Novaya Gazeta. Istimirova was described by Human Rights Watch as one of Chechnya's most prominent rights defenders. She was especially instrumental in revealing the mopping up operation in Novi Aldi on February 5, 2000. In the days after the massacre and destruction, Istimirova gathered video footage and compiled them with video recordings made by villagers in the film Aldi. On July 15, 2009, Istimirova was kidnapped near her home in Grozny and murdered later that day in the neighboring republic of Ingushetia. The Guardian reports that Istimirova's friends believe her death was a state-sponsored execution meant to scare residents and activists from seeking aid or working in Chechnya. On September 13, 2021, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that although Russia had failed to properly investigate Istimirova's murder, it didn't find the Russian authorities to be directly responsible for kidnapping or the murder. No one has ever been charged or prosecuted for Istimirova's murder. Despite being a member of the Communist Party from 2011 to 2016, Denis Voroyenkov and his party were considered unofficial Kremlin allies for years. But after fleeing to Ukraine with his wife in October 2016, Borodiankov became a vocal critic of Putin. Borodiankov also claimed that he only supported the annexation of Crimea due to political pressure. Borodiankov was going to testify against Ukraine's former president, Viktor Yanukovych. On the day of his murder, Borodiankov also had plans to meet with Ilya Ponomarev, another former Duma member who fled Russia because he voted against the annexation of Crimea. On March 23, 2017, Borodiankov was shot and killed in Kyiv in broad daylight. The attacker, identified as Pavlo Pashov, was also shot by Borodiankov's bodyguard and later died in the hospital. Although Ukraine's Prosecutor General Yuri Lutsenko claimed that Voronyakov's murder was a contract killing, it's never been proven who is behind Voronyakov's murder. Nikolai Lushkov was close with Boris Berezovsky and would end up being found dead 5 years after his friend's untimely demise. A businessman who was at one point deputy director of Aeroflot Airline, Lushkov fled Russia after he was accused of fraud and sought asylum in the United Kingdom. Lushkov was granted political asylum in 2010, and in 2017, a Russian court found him guilty in absentia of stealing over $118 million from Aeroflot. After Berezovsky's death in 2013, Lushkov was adamant that foul play was involved, and in an interview with The Guardian, he noted that the list of Russians who opposed Putin was shrinking. 5 years later, on March 12, 2018, Lushkov was found strangled in his home. In April 2021, coroners ruled that Lushkov was murdered. Lushkov's murder remains unsolved.
In 2020, Vladimir Putin introduced a series of changes to Russia's constitution that many believed were intended for him to maintain power. Part of these changes involved getting rid of Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, a former Russian president himself, and his cabinet. Medvedev was replaced by a relatively unknown tax official named Mikhail Mishustin. Many observers believe that appointing Mishustin, who is seen as being unambitious and with few backers aside from Putin himself, was a strategic play by Putin. Political analyst Kirill Rogov told the Associated Press at the time that these changes might indicate that Putin is trying to set up a government that mirrors one used by China. He's quoted as saying, "Such a model resembling the Chinese one would allow Putin to stay at the helm indefinitely, while encouraging rivalry between potential successors. While Russia's official plan of succession is in place, Putin seems to be trying anything he can to stay in power longer. That's why many believe he tapped Mishustin as his successor, because he would be easy to control and less likely to challenge Putin's authority. The thought is that if Putin vacates his position as president, Mishustin would take control of presidential matters, while Putin either takes over as prime minister again or crafts a new position for himself. Putin is believed to have done this once before. Putin chose Medvedev as his successor in 2007. Then Medvedev named Putin the new prime minister. This caused some turmoil, as this was done without any elections or input from the public. Many also consider Putin to have remained in charge during this time, even if Medvedev held the presidential title. Not only could Putin stay in power, many believe it's his only option. The thought is that at this point, Putin is in over his head, and that a peaceful transfer is almost impossible. In 2020, when Putin unveiled his plans to rework the structure at the top of the Russian government, Alexei Navalny said that Putin can't change his ways. He continued, "The only goal of Putin and his regime is to stay in charge for life, having the entire country as his personal asset and seizing its riches for himself and his friends." Do you see a lot of mafia bosses decide, after decades of stealing and killing, to retire quietly to some beach house with all their money? How about narco-traffickers? Also think about the major dictators. How many of them end their reigns with a peaceful retirement? By carefully choosing his successors, Putin can limit the possibility of a coup. One anonymous Western European intelligence official has said that having a political heir is an invitation to a coup in most authoritarian structures, like organized crime. And letting that heir build their own independent political and power base through legitimate authority almost guarantees one. This is why many saw the appointment of Mishustin as a bit of a tell as far as Putin's intent to hang on to power. If the next person in line to the presidency is seen as someone who lacks political ambition and has few powerful allies within the government, the likelihood of an internal power struggle becomes highly unlikely.
I've had nightmares that make more sense than this.
In the event that Putin is overthrown, a suitable replacement could be Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu. He's highly regarded as a politician, and his acumen when it comes to military strategy has earned him some of the highest praise of any Soviet or Russian commanding officer since World War II. However, Shoigu was involved in decision-making that led to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a significant stain on his resume.